Moving into a cheap apartment always seems like a great idea at first until you realize why it's so cheap. In my case, it was the bathroom. The building I moved into was old, and the bathroom in my apartment was disgusting. Mold covered the walls, and no matter how hard I scrubbed, I couldn't get rid of the stains. The smell was unbearable, a mixture of dampness and something I couldn't quite place. Something rotten. It was like the whole place was decaying. At first, I ignored it. I was busy with work and rarely spent much time at home. But on the few nights when I was home, I started to notice things. Strange things. The first time I realized something was off was when I heard a weird noise coming from the bathroom. It sounded like something was dripping down the walls, but there wasn't any visible leak. I checked the shower, the sink, even the drain, but everything seemed fine. Yet the sound persisted. Soft, like water slowly seeping through the walls. I brushed it off, assuming it was just the old pipes acting up. But as the weeks went on, things started to get worse. The smell became unbearable. More putrid than before, and the mold spread faster than I could clean it. It was as if the bathroom itself was rotting, no matter how much I tried to fix it. One night, after a particularly long and exhausting day, I decided to take a quick shower before bed. The smell was worse than usual, but I was too tired to care. I turned on the shower and waited for the water to heat up. That's when I saw it. On the floor, near the drain, something was moving. At first, I thought it was just a wad of hair stuck in the drain, but when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't hair at all. It was a leg. A human leg, shriveled and pale, almost like it had been dead for weeks. It was wriggling slowly, as if trying to crawl its way down the drain. My breath caught in my throat, and I blinked, trying to clear my vision, hoping that what I was seeing was just some twisted trick of the light. I shut my eyes tight, counted to 3, and when I opened them again, the leg was gone. Only the drain remained, clogged with black gunk. I should have left that apartment then and there, but I convinced myself it had to be some kind of hallucination. Maybe I was just overworked and stressed. But the next few days, things got even worse. The smell in the bathroom became unbearable. And at night, I started hearing strange noises. Something was scraping against the walls, and at times it sounded like something or someone was licking them. Other times, it sounded like something was scratching at the floor, trying to escape from the drain. I spoke to a neighbor about it, hoping for some logical explanation. He just shrugged and told me it was probably the akaname. According to him, the akaname was a creature that lived in filthy bathrooms, feeding off the grime and dirt. He said it's drawn to places that are neglected, and once it moves in, it's almost impossible to get rid of. I laughed it off at first. It sounded ridiculous. Just another urban legend to explain away the strange things that happen in old apartments. But as the days went by, I started to believe there might be something to it. The smell, the noises, the leg disappearing down the drain. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I began cleaning the bathroom obsessively, scrubbing every inch of it in the hopes of getting rid of the stench and whatever was lurking there. But no matter how much I cleaned, the smell only got worse. And then, one particularly quiet night, I heard it again, the scraping sound, louder this time, coming directly from the shower drain. I froze, straining to hear. The sound continued, more insistent, as if something was clawing its way up through the pipes. I couldn't bear to stay there any longer. I bolted out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me, as if that would somehow keep whatever it was from getting out. Since that night, I haven't used the bathroom. I avoid it as much as possible, but sometimes, even when I'm in a completely different room, I can still hear it. The sound of something licking or scraping against the walls, waiting for the right moment to come back. Urban legends have always been a part of daily life in Japan. Ever since I was a kid, I'd heard stories about the Teke Teke, but I never took them seriously. People said she was the spirit of a woman who was cut in half by a train, and now roams the tracks, looking for revenge. The story goes that if you encounter Teke Teke, she'll chase after you. With her impossible speed, she'll catch you and slice you in half, just like what happened to her. It seemed like one of those over-the-top horror stories meant to scare kids. I never believed in it. At least, not until what happened to me. It was a typical Friday, and as usual, I was heading home late from work. It was close to midnight, and the train station was nearly empty. Like always, I was alone on the platform, waiting for the last train. It was a small station in a quiet town, and at that time of night, the only thing you could hear was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. The silence was deep, almost unsettling, but I was used to it. While waiting, distracted by my phone, I heard something that made me freeze. A strange noise, like something scraping against the concrete. At first I thought it was a rat or maybe some animal wandering around the station, but the sound grew louder. Closer. It was a rhythmic noise, something like Teke Teke Teke. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a coincidence, just a weird sound. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something at the far end of the platform. Something moving. At first, it looked like just a shadow, but as the sound grew louder, I could see it more clearly. It was a woman, or at least the top half of a woman. She was dragging herself along the ground with her arms, her body twisted and disfigured. Her eyes, her eyes were locked onto mine, filled with anger and pain. The lower half of her body was completely gone, as if it had been violently ripped off. But the most terrifying part was the speed. With every pull of her arms, the sound, Teke Teke, grew louder, more frantic. I was frozen. It was the Teke Teke. There was no doubt in my mind. The legend, the story I always thought was ridiculous, was happening right in front of me. My entire body locked up, and all I could do was stare as she crawled closer and closer. Time seemed to slow down. I could hear my own breathing, quick and shallow. The sound of her arms scraping against the ground, the relentless Teke Teke filled my ears, and I knew that if I didn't do something, she would reach me. And if she reached me, the sound of the approaching train snapped me back to reality. The headlights cut through the darkness, and with all the strength I had, I forced myself to move. I ran toward the train, not daring to look back. Her sound grew louder, more desperate, as if she was right behind me. I could feel her. I could feel her hatred, but I kept running. When the train doors opened, I jumped inside and the doors closed behind me. The train pulled away, and as we left the station, I finally dared to look out the window. The platform was empty. She was gone. I sat down, trembling, my heart still pounding in my chest. I knew what I had seen was real, and ever since that night, I've never waited for the last train again. Never again. Working in a museum always seemed like a peaceful job. Most days, the place is quiet, especially at night after the last group of visitors has left, and all that remains is the sound of silence. However, the museum where I work has a unique feature. It's known for housing one of Japan's oldest legends, the story of Okiku, the servant who was unjustly accused of breaking a valuable plate and was brutally murdered because of it. Her body was thrown into a well, and they say her spirit still haunts the place, counting plates at night, always stopping at 9 because she never finds the 10th plate that would have saved her from her tragic fate. People talk about feeling a strange presence near the well, as if Okiku herself is still there, trapped in her eternal torment. I've always found the story fascinating, but to be honest, I never believed there was any truth to it. It was a great attraction for the museum. Sure, something visitors loved, especially tourists. But the night it all happened, my view of it changed forever. It was a typical Friday night, and I was doing the museum's closing shift. I had stayed late to go over some paperwork in the office, and by the time I finished, the place was completely empty. The automatic lights dimmed as I walked down the halls, and the only sound was the echo of my footsteps. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive, but I was used to it. As I made my way out, I passed by the outdoor courtyard where Okiku's famous well is located. Normally, I never felt anything unusual there, but that night, as soon as I approached, a shiver ran down my spine. The air felt thicker, and the musty smell of damp stone was more intense than usual, almost suffocating. Like something had been festering in the air for days, maybe even years. I decided to check it out, thinking there might be a leak or some water damage. The courtyard was dimly lit by a single flickering lamppost, casting long, shifting shadows on the ground. The well stood at the center, its stone walls covered in moss. As I got closer, I crouched down to look inside, shining my phone's flashlight into the darkness below. I wasn't expecting to see anything out of the ordinary. Just stagnant water, maybe a few leaves that had fallen in. But when the light hit the surface, my blood froze. In the reflection, I saw her. The face of a woman. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her long black hair hung wet and limp around her face. She was staring straight at me from the water's reflection, her eyes hollow and lifeless, yet full of something I couldn't quite describe. Despair, maybe? Or anger? For a moment I couldn't breathe. It felt like she was watching me, waiting for something. Her reflection remained perfectly still, even as the water rippled slightly from the wind. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was transfixed, locked in place by her gaze. Then, suddenly, I heard it, a sound that I will never forget. The distinct crash of plates shattering somewhere nearby. At first, I thought maybe one of the cleaning staff had dropped something, but I quickly remembered I was alone. There was no one else in the museum. The sound echoed again, one plate breaking, then another and another. It was coming from all directions, as if it were surrounding me. I stood frozen in fear, unable to make sense of what was happening. The legend of Okiku came flooding back into my mind. The story of her counting plates, endlessly searching for the missing 10th plate she never found in life. The sound of the 9th plate shattering was the loudest, then silence. Complete, terrifying silence. I backed away from the well, my heart racing, and that's when I heard something else. A soft whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from the well itself. It was almost unintelligible, but it sounded like someone was calling for me, pleading. It sent a chill through my entire body, and I finally managed to turn and run. I didn't stop running until I reached the front entrance of the museum. I stood there, panting and trembling, trying to catch my breath and process what I had just experienced. The well, the face, the plates shattering, it all seemed impossible. But it was real. I had seen it, heard it, I knew it was real. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face in the water, those hollow eyes staring at me. And the sound of those plates breaking over and over, it echoed in my mind like a nightmare on repeat. The next day, I returned to the museum, but I avoided the courtyard completely. Since that night, I've never been able to go near the well again. And every time the museum is quiet, every time the building is empty at night, I still hear it. The sound of Okiku counting her plates, always stopping at 9, forever trapped in her search for the missing 10th plate. I can't help but wonder what will happen when she finally finds it. Ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated by haunted places. Japan especially is full of legends about vengeful spirits and cursed locations, but none intrigued me as much as the story of the Kiyotaki tunnel. Located just outside of Kyoto, the tunnel was built in the early 1900s, and according to legend, many workers died during its construction. They say their spirits still haunt the place, and at night, anyone passing through might see or feel these restless souls. But what really caught my attention was the strangest part of the legend. People say the tunnel changes its length. During the day, the tunnel seems short, but at night, it stretches, as if space itself warps in response to the spirits that dwell within. Of course, I never really believed the story, but being the curious person I am, I decided to see for myself. I chose a cold winter night when the temperature was low and fog blanketed the roads. It was nearly midnight when I arrived at the tunnel's entrance. The atmosphere was unsettling, but I was determined. As soon as I drove into the tunnel, something felt off. The air grew heavy, like it was pressing down on me. The dim lights flickered, and the sound of my car engine seemed distant, muffled. But what bothered me the most was the silence. Even with the hum of the engine, there was a deep, oppressive quiet that made it feel like I was being watched. The road ahead seemed endless. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the tunnel seemed to stretch on forever. The longer I drove, the more uneasy I felt. It was as if the tunnel was growing longer, deeper, and the exit was nowhere in sight. Then I heard it. A strange noise, faint at first, like something scraping against the side of the car. I thought it might be the wind or debris in the tunnel, but the sound grew louder. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when my heart stopped. There was someone in the back seat. A woman, with long black hair obscuring her face, was sitting perfectly still, staring directly at me. Or at least, I felt like she was. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to keep control of the car. I glanced back at the mirror, and she was still there. There was no way she could have gotten into the car. The doors had been locked. The temperature inside the car dropped. My breath formed clouds in the cold air, and the woman seemed to inch closer, even though she hadn't moved. Then, breaking the silence, I heard it. A faint whisper, but it filled the car, as though it was coming from everywhere at once. Stop. It was a command, but I couldn't. Every instinct told me to keep driving, to not stop for anything. I pressed down on the gas, but the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly. The woman remained still, but I could feel her presence growing stronger, the cold intensifying. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the light at the end of the tunnel. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the air returned to normal. The temperature rose, the sound of the engine was clear again, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, she was gone. I don't know what would have happened if I had stopped, and honestly, I don't want to find out. Since that night, I've never returned to the Kiyotaki tunnel, and to this day I feel like that woman is still waiting for someone to stop. I've always been a practical person, maybe even a skeptic. Growing up in Japan, I heard all kinds of strange stories about ghosts and urban legends, and to be honest, I never paid much attention to them. They just seemed like tales meant to scare kids. But after what happened that night, my perspective changed entirely. It was a typical Wednesday, but work had stretched way past normal hours. By the time I checked my watch, it was already past 10 p.m. The city was deserted, as it always is at that hour, and I was preparing for my usual 15-minute walk home. It wasn't far, but something felt off that night. A light mist was forming on the streets, not unusual for that time of year, but the cold, that strange chill, it didn't feel like it was coming from the air, but from inside me, like something was wrong. I walked faster, trying to shake off the creeping discomfort, when turning a corner, I saw her. She stood on the sidewalk, under the dim light of a street lamp. She wore a surgical mask, the kind people started wearing during the pandemic. Nothing seemed particularly strange about that, but there was something unsettling about the way she stood. Completely still, her head tilted slightly to the side. I couldn't figure out exactly what bothered me, but something wasn't right. I tried to pass by her without making eye contact, but just as I got closer, she stepped into my path. My heart instantly sped up. Instinctively, I prepared to dodge her, but then she spoke. "Am I pretty?" Her voice was soft, almost too sweet, but there was something off in her tone. That question threw me off completely. Who asks a stranger something like that? I looked at her, confused, trying to come up with an answer that made sense. Her eyes, partly visible behind the mask, were dark, empty, even, like there was no life in them. Yeah, sure, you're pretty," I stammered, trying to move past her. But she didn't move. Instead, with a slow, deliberate motion, she raised her hands and calmly pulled down her mask. And that's when I saw it. Her mouth, or what was left of it, It was as if someone had taken a knife and sliced her face from ear to ear, creating a grotesque, twisted smile. The skin around her lips was torn, exposing jagged teeth and swollen gums. Dried blood marked the edges of the cuts, and as she smiled, the stench of rot filled the air. I gagged, feeling a wave of nausea and terror wash over me. "And now?" she asked again, her voice darker, almost inhuman. "Do you still think I'm pretty?" I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the ground. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. I knew the legend. Everyone did. The Kuchisake-onna, the slit-mouthed woman. They say if you tell her yes, she kills you with a pair of scissors. If you say no, the result is the same. There's no way out. My body started to shake, and the air around me seemed to close in. She stared at me with those lifeless eyes, and I knew I had to do something, anything. Without thinking, I took a step back, and then another, before I turned and ran. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the empty streets, but I could hear something behind me. Her footsteps, light and quick, almost like she was running without effort. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I knew that if I did, it would be the end. Finally, I turned the corner onto my street and nearly slammed into my front door as I fumbled to get inside. I locked every lock I had, leaning against the door, trying to catch my breath. For a few minutes, I stood there listening, but everything was silent. That night, I barely slept. The image of her mutilated face, that twisted smile, haunted my thoughts. Since then, I've never walked down that street at night again. And even during the day, I sometimes feel like she's still there, watching me, waiting for me to answer her question.